we have just a couple people trickling in, but we'll go ahead and get started. We have a lot of wonderful content to cover. So I don't want us to wait any further. Hi, welcome. We are so glad that you have joined us today. We are just so thrilled to have this wonderful group together. I am going to let my colleagues formally introduce themselves, but I just wanted to welcome you as the chapter president, Amy Lampy, AFP Houston chapter. And I want to just send some quick reminders. Early bird registration for ICON is coming up. It ends on Sunday, so make sure to register for ICON. And then our next program is Building Community Connection in an Uncertain Digital Climate with Black Sheep Agency. So hope you will join us for that on March 19th. With that, I'm going to give it over to my colleagues to start with introductions. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Amy. And good morning, everyone. And thank you guys so much for being with us today for today's program. My name is Greg Lee, and I'm a corporate relations manager with United Way of Greater Houston. And I'm going to be one of your moderators today for this event. And we've got some really great panelists with us today. And our hope is that you all are going to leave here today with some great perspective on better navigating your career during this very strange but challenging time we've all been going through together. But first, I'm going to turn it over to my co-pilot, Marcus Brewer, who's going to introduce himself and also our awesome panelists that we have with us today. Marcus?
Thanks, Greg, and good morning, everybody. And thanks again for being part of this discussion. As you said, my name is Marcus Brewer. I'm the Director of Advancement for the Synacor Foundation. And what we do is provide inpatient and outpatient services to adolescents and adults who are dealing with substance abuse disorders. Now, I get to introduce this great panel of people. First is Mr. Steve Newton. Steve heads the Russell Reynolds Associates in Dallas, and until recently also led the Houston office, so he was kind of busy. Not so much now, just one office. He's a key member of the CEO and board advisory partners, and previously co-led the financial services team for the Americas. In addition to numerous other leadership roles in the firm, Steve has decades of experience leading searches for CEOs, and board members of prestigious for-profit and nonprofit organizations, family businesses, and public institutions. So he could be a great resource for you guys, for everyone. He works closely with clients across a range of industries and sectors, including the energy and natural resources, financial services, and private equity. Steve Newton. Next is Rebecca Koch, or Becky. It's like the B-E-C-C-Y, if people wonder how to say it's Becky. Becky began professionally at IBM, serving global and national companies while working in strategy development, organization development, consulting. Becky discovered her ability to change the outcomes of leaders and currently dedicates a great deal of her time to designing and delivering comprehensive programs for developing those leaders. She also focuses on helping organizations and teams to develop positivity-based work environments. And we can use some of that right now with COVID. Her educational background includes a BBA from Texas A&M University, an MBA from Rice, and significant leadership research at UK-based university DBA program. And rounding up the panelist is Dr. Sandy Frieden. She is in management. She's a management leadership consultant and a coach with more than 30 years of experience in higher ed, nonprofit, corporate, and community capacity building. She has held state and national leadership positions on quite a few boards and has been invited to speak locally, nationally, and internationally. She's had her passport stamped a few times. Her focus is the empowerment of individuals, teams, organizations, so that they can reach their full potential. So that's our panel. And now I'll toss it over to Greg to get us started on the first question.
All right, awesome. Before we do get started, just to keep the program flowing and be courteous of everyone's time, we ask that if you have any questions for one of our panelists, just put it in the Q&A section down there, one of those buttons down there, and we've allotted time towards the end of the hour to help address those questions. So with that said, let's go ahead and dive right in. And my first question is going to be for you, Steve. Now, this has been a very challenging year to say the least, and according to the data released by the Texas Workforce Commission, Metro Houston has lost over 140,000 jobs in 2020, which was a single year loss for our region. Now, there may be some folks in our audience today that may have been one of those who have been impacted by the pandemic, and some who may be looking for a job for the first time in a very long time. What kind of advice would you give to some of our job seekers right now in the nonprofit sector to help bounce back in this current environment that we're in? And what kind of resources do you feel they could best utilize for support?
Thank you. And before I get started, I do want to thank all of you on the audience today. I have personally been involved with a great number of nonprofits, both from a professional point of view, recruiting to those organizations, as well as my own service on boards. So I know the work you do. The work you do is remarkable, and none of these organizations would be in the positions they're in without your leadership. So I want to thank you all for having chosen the careers that you've chosen. Now, having said that, the careers you've chosen are difficult careers, not because they are more difficult than others, but because every career today is undergoing tremendous transformation. Greg, you asked, what can one do in a difficult job market? And I would like to sort of roll that question back a little bit and sort of think about a career as a continuum more than a moment in time. And so allow me to be a David Letterman for just a few minutes and talk to you about from a list of attributes and things that I and my colleagues have worked up together, which we think will be relevant to those in the audience today. First of all, I'll just take a few minutes to go through this list, and obviously open to questions afterwards. Be thoughtful about your career change. Remember that as we look at resumes of development officers, they tend to be lots and lots of stops along the way, always with the good excuse that we're chasing the next capital campaign or there's a reason to make that move. Remember that the people who are recruiting you are CEOs and board members and may not be as aware of those kinds of career hops and the benefits of those. So they tend to be more conservative. So all I'm saying there is be very thoughtful. Don't always chase the next campaign, but think about how you're building a strategic career, not just a transactional career. Secondly, let me just talk about innovation and technology. It's disrupting every career. It's certainly disrupting your industry. Please embrace it. Use technology as a tool. The fact that we're on Zoom today is good evidence of that, and show yourself to be at the forefront of adopting technology and innovation in how you go about what has traditionally been a very traditional type of career. The third piece, which we're seeing more and more, is this need to combine marketing with development. So the marketing function, when I say marketing, I'm also including communications. Remember that today we're seeing this more as a continuum. So don't fight it, join it. And if to the extent you don't have experience in this area, find ways within your organization, take courses. We've got a couple of academics on our screen today. Take courses that will get you up that curve. Next point I would say is learn to manage, even if it's only one or two people on your staff. Make sure that you are learning how to manage people, because that will be a big part of your future career as you develop more experience, and it's something that you can learn at a very early age. The other thing that we see a need for, and we don't always see it amongst our development candidates, is true financial acumen. So when we think of you all, you are raising money, lots of money, remarkable amounts of money, but we don't always see the linkage between the monies being raised and the monies being spent. So to the extent that you have the ability to understand your income statement of your nonprofit, understanding the balance sheet and the impact of those dollars, I think you will come across as a more strategic partner to the CEO of your organization. And I would also add, join every, it sounds intuitive, but join every task force you're given the opportunity to, because one of the things that we see about development is that it can be viewed as very narrow. The more you learn about the organization, the impact, the social impact, the arts impact, the impact you have in broad terms, the more you will be seen as a strategic advisor to the CEO, which we think is such an important role for you to play. There's one or two other points before I leave this to my colleagues. The biggest thing we have learned in this past year as search consultants, and it's something we've been talking about a lot over the previous 4 or 5 years, but it's come home to roost this year more than ever, is this need to pivot. And what I mean pivot, and let me give you a couple of examples. We define leadership along 4 matrix in our business: setting strategy, executing for results, leadership, and relationships and influence. And if I just take one of those, the relationships and influence, which is such an important part of what you do every day. At one end of the spectrum, we have people who are galvanizing. Think of it, so George Patton kind of galvanizing. And the other end of the spectrum, we have people who can connect with individuals. You need to know under what circumstances do you portray yourself as a galvanizing person versus a connecting person. And if I just take another example as well of setting strategy, the 2 ends of that spectrum are being disruptive and being pragmatic. There are times in strategy to be disruptive in your industry. There are times you need to be enormously pragmatic. And those leaders who can pivot from one end to the other are those who can survive difficult times or changing times as we see today. So Greg, with that, I feel I've exhausted my time, but I would love to talk further as we get into this conversation and hope this was helpful.
Awesome. Thank you, Steve. Really appreciate the insight. Marcus, you're on mute.
If I took my mute off, that would help, wouldn't it? And don't forget, you guys, if you got questions, please put your questions in the Q&A. Next up, I get to ask a question of Becky. Now, I wish I really would have met you 9 months ago, because I just got back to work, just got my new key card at the end of December. I was on an extended COVID vacation, so I could have probably used your advice. So what kind of suggestions would you give to somebody who is on that vacation to kind of stay sane? That movie, it's not you, it's not about you, it's me. How can you help somebody stay out of the, no, it's really me?
Okay. All right. Thanks, Marcus. I wish I would have met you as well. Well, let me I want to talk about grit. Okay. And I'm using Angela Duckworth's book that she published in 2016. It's research-based. It's very interesting. It's called Grit, the book is. And I'm using it as my guidance on this discussion, because what we're finding is that we really need to have grit, okay? And all the things that Steve was talking about just a few minutes ago with pivoting and being able to, come forward with this type of leadership or that type of presence or whatever, what backs it up is this element of grit and being able to get through tough times, okay? And so in her book, Angela proposes that we need grit when times are tough. And I think everybody would agree right now that times are tough. We've all been through tough times. I don't think anybody has been spared. Grit is a psychological character trait that's reinforced through our behaviors and actions. And to define it in Angela's terms, she said that grit is our passion and perseverance needed in tough times and when pursuing tough goals. Okay, so passion and perseverance. What I want to do as we go through this little chat is to break down what we mean by passion and perseverance and break it into factors. But first, let me just share with you Angela's description of grit in the book. I really, really like it. And listen to the words she says. The highly successful have a kind of ferocious determination that plays out in 2 ways. First, these people are usually resilient and hardworking. Second, they know in a very deep way what they want. Not only do they have determination, they have direction. So I love that description of it. There's a lot embedded in it. And this relates very closely to what I like to focus on when I'm working with people. And I believe that people are attracted to others who have clarity over their future, where they're going, what they're doing, why they're doing it, and energy to pursue it. And if you think about how she's defined grit, that's very closely aligned with the factors that I focus on a lot. in my work with people in different organizations and as independents. So let's think about that. Do you have energy over what you're doing? Do you have clarity over where you're going, why you're doing it, what you want in the future? I think that's an important question we have to ask ourselves and think about as we're going along and taking actions every day. So I do believe that this past year has been one of the toughest times that we've seen in a long time. And interestingly enough, for the last 6 months or so, this topic, speaking about getting through tough times, has been probably the most requested topic for me to talk about. Easily, I've spoken to well over 1,000 people about it. And that is because it's tough for people right now, universally, personally, professionally, organizationally, and at the individual level. They're just that nobody is spared on this. Would you agree about that? Tough times bring around tough goals in order to recover from them. And tough times can make tough goals seem even harder. And that's all interconnected. So when times get really tough, that's when the presence of grit makes a determination over whether or not you have success. So this really resonated with me because I set a lot of tough goals for myself. And some of them I'm able to accomplish and some I don't. Some get dropped. And you have to ask yourself, well, why? Why do they get dropped? And I looked up, I thought, well, I just want to know how often this happens, and checked out some common answers. And just think to yourself when you're thinking about this, how often do you think individuals are able to accomplish their goals, or what percentage or average of people accomplish their goals? And what about organizations? And when we talk about organizations accomplishing their goals, we usually talk in terms of executing their strategies. Okay, so what do you think the numbers are? I wish we could talk back and forth. That's what I'm missing with this medium. But let me give them to you. Ready? 8%. 8% on the average of individuals actually accomplish their goals. And they're more talking about tough long-term goals. 8%. At the organization level, that average is about 10%. 10% of the strategies that are set in place actually get fully executed. Now, when you think about that, I mean, the first thing that comes to my mind is, holy cow, that's pretty low, don't you think? So why? There's a lot of factors involved, and boy, we could spend all day long talking about all the factors involved in this, but let's just focus in the one that Angela points out in her book, and that is grit. When you have grit, perseverance, and passion, you tend to be more successful. That almost guarantees your success, okay? So let's look at that. First of all, perseverance. Let's break it down. Perseverance is doing something despite the difficulty. It requires a couple of different things. First of all, she focuses on resilience. It requires resilience to continue. Resilience is that tendency not to abandon goals after failure or after facing obstacles. It's about bouncing back after failure. I like to think of resilience as about bouncing forward. Bouncing back isn't good enough for me. I want to bounce forward. Okay, that's a key slight distinction. But if you think about it in terms of that, it is about pushing yourself even further. Okay, I had intended to speak a lot about resilience today, and I changed my mind after last week. I think if you're Houston based, we all were tested. We all acted with resilience, and check that box. I want to move on and I want to spend some more time on some of the other factors. I think it was we all were tested and we came out on the strong side if you're Houston based or Texas based. The second factor that Angela focuses on with perseverance is having a growth mindset. Okay. And usually when we talk about mindset, we talk about it in terms of two ways, either a growth mindset or a fixed mindset. A growth mindset acknowledges that given the time to develop and given practice and focus and effort, that we can develop just about anything we want to. Okay, we can develop any capability or any skill that we want to. The alternative to that is a fixed mindset, and that's you either have it or you don't. Okay, and that's a subtle difference. And the thing that's the thing that you've got to be careful about right now, out in the publishing world, out in the books that are available and the theory that's available about leadership and development and all that, there's still a great deal of mix of what I would call traditional theory versus more progressive, newer theory. Traditional theory focuses more on that it factor. You have that it factor for leadership. You've either got it or you don't, sort of thing. And I don't believe that that is the case, because I believe in growth mindset. Okay, very distinct difference. Watch for it when you're reading different articles or publications. Okay. The third thing that Angela really focuses on, I spend a great deal of time with people on this, is about self-talk. What is that message playing over and over again on your head? Okay. And this can be very subtle. Let me give you an example. I was working with somebody recently, and she was focused on setting her future goals and setting herself up for success in the future. And she came back with a list of guidelines for herself. And all of these guidelines, surprisingly, and nearly all of them surprisingly, started with, don't be afraid to. Okay, that phrase, don't be afraid to. While I do believe we should acknowledge fear where fear exists, I don't feel like we should overly reinforce it. And what she was doing was she was talking to herself in a negative framing over and over again. I asked her to change those guidelines and say instead, act with courage too. Do you see the subtle difference? It's very small difference there, but that kind of framing. So really pay attention to what are the self messages that are playing in your head, write them down if you need to, and look at each one of them and rephrase them to be in a positive, forward moving, forward facing mode. Okay, that's the positivity side of that, right? So let's look at so that's perseverance, if we wanted to focus on that. Let's look briefly at passion, the other side of that. Passion is that strong desire to do amazing things. You know, it's that fire in the belly that we need to act, to be motivated, the energy. I talked about energy earlier, that that we're attracted to other people that have energy. We want to get involved in what they're doing. We're interested in it because this motivation to act shows up as energy. This is a really hard thing to fake or force. And I'm going to give you some guidance in just a minute on how you can build it. Okay. The second thing that's in passion that she focuses on is that long-term commitment, not giving up, not letting it go, and consistency over time, that loyalty to the goals, because it's really easy to be enthusiastic and committed early on, and it's really hard to make it beyond that. Another reference that I really like to point you to when it comes to that motivation and long-term drive is Dan Pink's book called Drive. It's a very good science and research-based book on the subject, okay? So I'm going to end by focusing on 4 actions that you can take to build grit. And this is building it in yourself. It could be building it in your teams if you're focused on your organization, but let's look at those real quickly. First is about showing interest and curiosity. When you show interest and curiosity in those tough goals, in getting to know them more, in understanding them better, what happens is that encourages other people to work along with you. They're drawn to that interest. So think about that. If you've had a goal that's been there for a long time and it's gone kind of dormant, brush it off, freshen it up, turn the lights on it, look at it and say, why is this interesting? Why do we need to do this? Why does this matter? Okay. And get that conversation going in a group if you can. The next thing is reinforcing the learning culture. And by learning culture, we mean make it safe to fail and to succeed. We learn through failure. Failure cannot shut us down. Failure must teach us something. Failure must help us develop, okay? And if we can get that going as part of the way we go about things, we will accomplish tough goals. The third thing is purpose. We have to feel like we're relevant. We have to feel like we're connected. This is where Simon Sinek's work on why really is very important. The why, we need to understand, why are we doing something? What's the purpose behind it? And if you're an individual right now, if you're working independently or you're alone, really spend time focused on your purpose and what your purpose is, and look as long-term as you can. That's such a good exercise for us to take, because then when we do that, the actions we take along the way make a lot more sense. And then the final thing is hope. It's having a sense of hope. This sense of hope really comes out in our language that we use around others and our language that we use with ourselves. That sense of hope really makes a difference. Pay attention to this. So I'd just like to point out in the handout that you're going to get, Angela has a self-assessment that you can take about grit. If you're curious as to know how you would score, it's online and I give you the link to that. And we'll have a chance to ask questions. And let me turn it back over to Marcus to take it to the next level.
Thank you,
Actually, it's
Becky.
going to go to me, Becky.
Okay, sorry.
Thank you so much for that. And thank you, Steve. That was some really great insight, really great advice. But speaking of Marcus, now, Marcus, you mentioned earlier that you were unfortunately someone who himself experienced job loss of your own during the pandemic. And just thinking about what Becky and Steve just said, what kind of challenges did you go through or were going through, and tell us kind of where you are now today again?
Okay, kind of just, ditto, ditto, ditto. Yeah, all the above. Kind of went through all that, and I was just thinking that resilience thing resonates, because that's one of the things when you're going through it, you need to hear that it's, that you'll get through it, that you're okay, because when you're in it, you just think, like I mentioned at the beginning, during the question, it's like, hey, what's wrong with me? What am I not doing? But realize that there are a lot of folks that are really great people who were laid off because of COVID. So it's really not you on this one. It's really not about you. But you've got to be strong. And I know some of the things that I did, because I was laid off in May and didn't find anything until the end of December. So it's like, Merry Christmas to me and my family on that one, because able to start the new year off with a new job. And going through it, Zoom, we've done Zoom interviews and Zoom meetings and things like that, but it's a little different when you're on the other side of it as part of a Zoom interview. And something I realized is that I don't like Zoom interviews because it's hard. It's hard because you can't read the body language of somebody in the room. You can't necessarily tell what their face means when they're making a face. Is it something that you're saying that they're smiling about, or they, or is it something that they're looking at somebody else's picture or something, or are they reading it in email or looking at something on another screen? And so you just, and it's one of the things that happened in one of my first Zoom interviews was one of the interviewees made a face, and it was just like and I wasn't sure if it was because of me, because she wasn't looking at the camera. So I wasn't sure if it was a face for me or if it was a face of something that she was doing, and it just completely threw me off. And I felt it. I felt the change in me in an interview. Went through it, but it's just one of those things that I had to work through. So I think they got better. The interviews got better, and I would suggest if you can, practice, lots of practice. Get your friends and do some practice interviews, some mock interviews on Zoom, just so you feel more comfortable when you're doing it, because you just have to, because now I think it's going to become one of the norms. Yes, people want to do more face-to-face, but that Zoom is going to be more of a norm for folks because schedules don't always align. And now people realize, oh, we can do this. So do that. Another suggestion I would make for you is your circle. Your circle of friends. And Becky talked about resilience. That's your circle helps you to maintain that. So reach out to your circle, your friends, and tell them to reach out to you, because when you're in the middle of this thing and you're trying to figure out what's going on, what am I going to do, what's next, finding the next job, and you're not getting the calls or you're getting interviews and you're not getting the job, you don't want you think, I don't want to talk to anybody right now. I don't feel like talking to anybody, but really that's what you need to do. You need to maintain that circle. You need to maintain that conversation and let people tell you, hey, you're okay, you're good, it's going to come, and the right thing is for you. If it's for you, it's for you. So you just have to believe that, because it is. The job I have right now, I'd seen it a few times with Cinecorp Foundation. I'd seen the email, LinkedIn and on Indeed, and on AFP. I think it was on AFP's website as well. And I was like, yeah, it looks good. It looks good. And I was thinking, because I had like 2 other things I was working on that I just knew were going to come through. And it was just taking a long time for it to happen. It's just taking a long time. And I decided that like the 3rd or the 4th time, I'm up one of those late night, early mornings when you're binge watching Netflix because you don't have to get up in the morning and go anywhere. And so I decided, okay, fine, I'll apply. I got a call the next day to schedule an interview. And then second interview, and then the final interview, and I got the job. And so it's one of those things you just have to trust yourself. And I always tell people, we're always hearing these whispers in our ear. We hear things a lot, but we've got to listen to it and follow. And don't let our yeah, but get in the way, because our yeah, but stop us from doing some pretty amazing things sometimes because we think we know better. But sometimes we don't always know the right thing to do. So hear it, listen, and follow is one of the things that you've got to do. And I think, yeah, I've been able with this position. I'm really excited about it with Cinecorp because I get to learn something new. I get to build a development department. They've been around for 54 years, but not really strong development. So I get to really create what it's going to look like, and support them and with their foundations and build new relationships with the supporters. So had I not listened to it, I wouldn't have had the opportunity to do this. So that's why I tell you, you just never know. You just never know. But always listen to your gut, talk to your friends, and network. There's lots of opportunities to network with people. Right now is probably the easiest time to connect with somebody that you wanted to talk to that may be in another state. It's easy now with the virtual. Everybody's, they're asking for 15, 20 minutes. You just want to talk to them and ask for advice. One of those great things as a fundraiser, when you ask for money, you get advice. When you ask for advice, you get money. Same thing with interviews. Ask for advice on, you've got a question, or you're trying to figure something out, or an opportunity is there. Would you help me kind of figure out how to ask these different questions? So think about some things like that as you're going through it, because you will get through it. You will get through it. You've already got some really great ideas and really, really good suggestions from folks. And I'm going to let the next panelist tell you what to do after this, because now, I've got this job. So now what am I going to do? And that's where Sandy comes in. Sandy's the after in this picture. You've gotten the before and everything, and now Sandy's the after. So now you got the before, I'm in it, and now Sandy's going to tell us, what do we do after? How do we prepare ourselves for that next step, or those steps up the ladder in our professional journey? So Sandy, how do we help us figure that out?
Okay, well, thank you, Marcus. And what an inspiring talk you have just yourself. So that's terrific. Thank you. So one thing I do want to say to everybody, y'all asked me to also say something about how do you onboard when you're doing it via Zoom, and we're hearing different responses to that. Marcus certainly had his experience that he talked about trying to do interviews on Zoom. And I have some information that I've put for you in the presentation that I've prepared. It's a handout that you'll get afterwards. So in terms of writing things down, most everything I'm saying is right there in the handout. And I do have some notes of suggestions about how to practice and things to take in mind. A lot of it is things that you would do anyway when you're preparing to do an interview. But to think about it specifically because it's going to be on Zoom. And so all of that is going to be in your presentation. So I'm not going to talk about it. I'm going to stay on the idea of how do you figure out when you're in a job, what do you want to do when you want to move up? how do you do that? What are the things that you really want to think about? So that's what I'm going to talk about. And one of the things about this is that being a high performer is something that gets you rewarded. And it's probably gotten you to where you are now, that you really know how to take the ball and run. You've got functional expertise. That is, there is some aspect of your work that you know a lot about, that you've become very, very good at. And so you want to be able to do that. And people think, well, I just get better and better at that. And so I'm more likely to get promoted. But that kind of deep knowledge about one area of what you do is not always the way that you're going to get promoted. So I'm going to be looking at, what do you want to do to move up to an executive level, to a more managerial level? What are the skills that you need? Peter Drucker, whose name you probably know as a big guru for management, he talks about what leaders need to let go of, which is a hard thing to think about. It says leaders need to be taught when to stop. This is a hard thing to take into account when you've been successful and been moving up the ladder all along because you've been better and better and better at what you're doing, but that may not be the way to go. Humans are hardwired to keep doing what has been successful. It has made our species successful on Earth. However, as much as we've been successful, some days I'm not so sure, but we keep doing the things that we've had success with, but sometimes you get into a situation where you need to do something different, and it's hard to make that change. John Maxwell, some of you know his name as well, talks about letting go and doing less so that you can make room for more things to happen. So I'm going to talk about some behaviors to let go of. And I want to be very clear, these things are not character traits. So you can actually let go of them. You can change what you're doing. So here's a variety of things that you can let go of. Command and control. How do you not be the one who's like the captain of the ship and giving orders all the time? This is, maybe it's worked for you before, but it's not a style that's going to work well at the executive level. If you need to win all the time, it's not about you. We've been hearing comments like that. It's not always about you, and it's not about needing to win. Not yourself. Everybody, the whole team maybe needs to win. The people that you're talking to need to win. It needs to be a mutual experience. Having overconfidence. Sometimes to be more humble, to be more modest about things can be more successful for you than being overconfident. Being defensive, being inflexible, being volatile, being arrogant. These things aren't good in most any situation, but sometimes people sort of power drive their way through to getting more and more success in their job, but they really aren't going to work well for them when they get farther along. And those were the easier things to let go of. Harder things to let go of. Distrust. I had someone once, the first time I ever had an assistant, an administrative assistant. After a while, she came to me and she says, you know, something that makes it very hard to work for you is you use the clutch method. And I said, well, I never heard of that. What's that? And she said, well, when you have things to do, you clutch them all to yourself and you don't really give stuff away to do. That makes it really hard to help you. And I realized, don't use the clutch method. Be ready to give things away. I'll say more about that in a minute. To be thinking my faults are virtues. People might say, well, you know, this is just the way I am. I just am like that. I just do things that way. This is not necessarily something that's going to be very successful. It's like you've got a fault, but you're clinging to it as though, well, that's just this inevitable part of you that you can't let go of. But you can. First, you have to recognize it. Then you can let go of it. When you say, oh, I knew that, like maybe your team is contributing ideas and they're excited because they have some new idea that they're going to give you that they think is going to help. And you say, well, I knew that. Or I'm just going to put in my 2 cents worth. That was a great idea, but I'm just going to give you my thoughts on that. It's like a put down for your staff, for your team who are trying to help you. And you want to be able to boost them, not put them down or undermine them in some way. Perfectionism, I'm sure we've all heard the saying about don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And more of us are probably perfectionists than we would like to admit. But it's not a healthy thing to do. Look for what's going to be good and what's going to work, and to let other people suggest their ideas and figure out what's going to work well, whether you think it's perfect or not. So there is something called executive intelligence that a person named Spencer Stewart conceived that idea. Executive intelligence. I like it. It sort of goes, there's of course, there's intellectual intelligence, there's emotional intelligence, which is one of the key factors in executive intelligence. And I'm sure you've all read things about emotional intelligence. If you haven't, Google it. And there's a million things to read about emotional intelligence. And emotional intelligence is generally credited with being the most successful component of a person's makeup. It's like you can be as smart as all get out, but can you really understand how to deal with your own emotions? How do you recognize and deal with other people's emotions? How do you handle those kinds of prickly situations? How can you be supportive and understanding? Those are really the factors that are going to move you forward more than how smart you are and how high your IQ is. So in an executive intelligence, you'd also look at more using your judgment, more doing problem solving. You're going to develop people and teams. Your job when you become a manager or an executive level person is to build your team. It's not about building yourself up anymore. It's about building them, helping them pull out their skills and learn how to be the best that they can be, getting them the support that they need. That becomes your job. Also, how do you drive change? How do you, as the leader of a group, how do you frame whatever the problem is? How do you assess what the priorities are going to be and foresee what the consequences are? This is the heart of change management. I always like to describe change management as keeping people from freaking out because things are changing. But these are the steps that you take to help make that happen. Following up persistently has been shown to be a very significant factor in being successful. That in fact, they've done studies and shown that following up persistently has caused the most massive improvement in maybe helping those percentages that I think it was Becky was talking about earlier about, well, how much success do people have in following up their goals as an individual or organization. Persistent follow-up has been one of the most successful factors in improving that. Recognizing and thanking people for what they've done, making sure that they are acknowledged in a way that they want to be acknowledged. Not everybody wants to be called up on the stage and thanked. Some people would rather get an individual letter written from their team leader acknowledging very specifically what they've done and thanking them for their contribution to what the team has done. Thinking about us and not me, it's a team effort. We've heard about passion and inspiration and emotion. Those are very important, not volatility, but passion and emotion. Those are very different things. And you want to be able to show those. You want to be honest and genuine at all times, and figure out how to operate well with risk. Different personality types do better with risk than others, but all of us have the ability to deal with risk, whether that's at the top of our skill list or not. We can pull that up out of ourselves and figure out, how do we deal with ambiguity and time constraints and insufficient information and multiple perspectives and the power dynamics of what's going on. There's a lot to look at. And so there's a lot to consider about how you have to function differently at this higher level. So what are the strategies that you can use to pull yourself forward? When you are the leader, remember that you are always on display, that everything you say, people take very seriously. You make some offhand comment and people say, well, the leader said that, so that must be what's real. And so you want to be very conscious of how you behave, how you treat other people, because you are the role model that will set the tone for everybody else. You want to recruit the strongest people that you can and mentor them and coach them. The smarter the people on your team are, the better. Don't ever be afraid of hiring very, very smart people. You want to cultivate strong relationships with your peers. You want to think beyond your area that yourself is doing. I think Steve was talking about developing your skills at understanding the budget. You may not be called on normally to handle the budget, but the more you understand that, the bigger picture you have about your job and the better you'll be able to do it. Get involved with your community. For yourself, do a professional development plan. What are the skills that you think you're missing and how could you develop them? And I strongly recommend that you develop your own personal board. Like, this is your board of advisors. Find your people and think of them that way and identify them. We were talking about, you can call anybody from anywhere, the people who have been most helpful and inspirational to you. Nominate them for your board and then call on them. So those are the suggestions that I have. You'll get all of this in the handout that you get after the meeting. That's it for me.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sandy. And as I promised you guys, we were going to field some of the questions at the end of the program. We've got some time. I see a few in the chat. The first one's just going to be for all of you in general. And this is really a good one because this is a really challenging time to ask for this. But what advice would you guys have for advocating for a raise for yourself during this challenging time, when I just mentioned that 140,000 job loss during 2020? How would you ask for a raise for yourself? This one's open to any of y'all who want to take it.
Greg, we've all decided to put ourselves on mute because we don't want to answer the question. It's a very tough question. And I think that, I would suspect most of the audience today is in the nonprofit sector. And I think you have to be very sensitive to the times that we're operating in, both from a institutional performance perspective, but also those out there in great need. It's probably not a good time to ask for a raise, but it is a good time at year end always to talk about your performance relative to expectations and setting metrics out there, which once you achieve them, you're in a better position to do it. But just asking for a raise for the sake of a raise is a very difficult question right now.
Yeah, if I could add just a little bit to that, Steve, also is that I think, and you said it's about positioning yourself and what you're doing. What I'd like to focus on is that it is about positioning yourself for growth and how you help the organization. And that has to be the core part of your asking around this. Acknowledging that right now might not be the right time for a raise or an adjustment, but what you'd like to do is you'd like to position yourself to operate at higher levels, to have a higher impact, and be positioned for that when the health of the organization allows for that. And if you can talk about it in terms of that, I think you'll have a better success in getting the ear of the people who have some say over it.
Thank you, Becky. Sandy, anything you want to add before?
No, I love what Becky said, because I was thinking in terms of making sure that you are always having ongoing conversations about the work that you're doing with whoever is the head of your team, so that they are aware of what your contribution is. So it's not like suddenly you're having to come up and remind them when you decide it's time to ask for a raise.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much. This next question comes from Asmin, and she's new to the nonprofit world. And she asks, how should we act daily if one is embracing fundraising as a new career coming from the program sector of nonprofits?
Well, I'll take this and I'll tie it back to that self-talk that you give yourself. And it's thinking in terms of, when you're switching from programs to fundraising, you're going from something, programs usually has a bit of a longer term reach, and fundraising, you're being measured every single day, even though you're going toward long reach goals. So being able to break that down and what you're doing, what are those actions you need to take every single day? How do you need to take positive actions forward every day, and holding yourself to that and putting positive self-talk around that, or positive reinforcements around that, and then looking at how that matters long term. So keep tying it to the long term, because that's where your comfort zone is coming from programs into fundraising. How does that fundraising equate in a long term?
And Becky, I'll add to that, just referring back to an internal document of ours. We talked about our 4 leadership metrics, and if I go to the one that refers to executing for results, let me just give you a few pointers from that, because I think it really does highlight the differences of going from as Becky said, a longer term programmatic approach to executing for results. And let me just read the overall captions. Quickly acts to seize opportunities to exceed expectations and drive higher performance. Balances an entrepreneurial style and calculated risk-taking, and I think Sandy talked about risk-taking, with a considered decision-making approach to drive quality outcomes, prioritizes, allocates, and manages resources strategically and efficiently, and leads through ambiguity, which, by the way, is enormously important right now, leads through ambiguity and complexity to develop a detailed plan of action in order to drive change successfully. So those are the attributes of execution, and I think there are few jobs in the world that can be better defined as through the eyes of execution.
Thank you, Steve.
Let me add one thing, and I want to go back to something Marcus said, because Marcus, you really got my attention on this statement. You said, when you ask for advice, you get money. When you ask for money, you get advice. And when you're switching into that, learn to build those relationships based on understanding. And calling people and saying, asking them advice, how can we serve your group better? Might be the question you ask on a more regular basis, instead of asking for, how can we get your money?
I like that. I like that. This next one's from John Bradshaw, and it's for you directly, Steve. Can you reiterate the 4 areas you look for when you're currently evaluating candidates during this time?
Yeah. Hi, John, and I'm glad you're on the call. Yeah, the 4 areas that we talk about, and I'm happy to send this out to you. The first is setting strategy. And by the way, strategy applies to every level of leadership, not just the CEO. Executing for results, which we just talked about. Leading teams, and relationships and influence. And someone asked also, of those 4, are there any 1 or 2 that are more important for the development role? Clearly executing for results and clearly relationships and influence are 2 that to me stand out as being critical in the eyes of a top development professional.
Thank you, Steve. And this next one's from Amelia. And this is, I think, you get a lot of yeses before you get a lot of no's, and you always want to try something in your next approach differently. So if you don't get a job and you would like to hear feedback as to what you could do better differently, what is the best avenue to get the person you interviewed with over Zoom to help share this with you? Because I know a lot of HR folks don't typically respond back when you send emails like that after the interview's over. So what advice?
This is a great question. This is a great question. I'm waiting to hear this, because it's just to hear, even get feedback that whether or not you got the job, sometimes you don't even get that. So I'd love to hear this feedback.
So I'll jump in and say, what I think where I would start is I would send them just a very brief email back and say, I really appreciate the time that you took today to talk with me, or the time that you took last week or whatever. And I am always in learning mode. What I would like to know is one or two things from that meeting that you felt like I did well, and one or two things that you felt like I need to take to another level, and see if they'll share that with you, or make it easy. Just say one thing I would like. We have to make feedback easy for people to give it to us. And then when they give it to us, we've got to make sure that we don't become defensive over it, that we take it in. And I like to think, and one of the word changes that I make a difference, instead of thinking about it as constructive feedback, because we hear that word constructive, we all immediately think critical and criticizing. I always say instructive feedback. And I think about instructive as being learning focused. And so making that little switch in our head makes us take it in a little differently, and see the quality of feedback you get via email from somebody. And if it's a quality feedback, then I would ask, hey, would you mind having a 15-minute conversation with me about this, and see where you can go.
Thanks, Becky. Anyone else want to chime in? Awesome. So it looks like we're up on the hour, and there's going to be a follow-up email that's sent out to all our attendees today with the materials from our speakers, the event recording, and our panelist contact info, just in case one of the questions that you asked didn't get answered. Feel free to reach out to them and ask that question, and maybe they can provide some